"Get the fuck out of this room." The words didn't just cut through the noise, they were a fucking grenade exploding in the center of the gilded ballroom. Shrapnel of shock and silence flew in every direction. 1,000 glittering champagne flutes seemed to tremble on the white linen tables. The crystal chandeliers overhead held their breath, and the low hum of 100 conversations flatlined. All that was left was the voice, young, vicious, and dripping with the kind of entitlement that only comes from a life lived without consequences. Tiffany Vandermeer, heiress to a tech fortune so vast it was obscene, stood there in a blood-red dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her smile was a weapon, a razor-sharp slash in the opulent air. She hadn't whispered it. Oh no, she'd broadcasted it, wanting every single guest, every server, every goddamn camera in the Aspen Peak Summit Gala to hear. And they did. Heads swiveled. Forks froze halfway to mouths dripping with caviar. A few nervous, sycophantic chuckles sputtered from her table of admirers, while others leaned in, their faces hungry for the scandal that was about to unfold. At the epicenter of this detonation, at the far end of the VIP table, the woman in the cobalt blue dress did not move. Not an inch. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, each strand a disciplined soldier in formation. She sat with a posture carved from granite, the kind you see in ancient queens or five-star generals surveying a battlefield. Her spine was a steel rod. Her gaze was level, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the chaos. Her silence was a deliberate, tactical choice. Before this shit show goes any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if you believe that arrogance and ignorance deserve to be put in their fucking place, do me a favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell stories here. We bear witness. And you're about to witness something you'll never forget. Now, back to her. Tiffany let the silence fester. Let it crawl under everyone's skin. Then she let out a laugh, a sound that wasn't born of humor but of cruelty. "Cobalt blue," she sneered, her voice loud enough to carry to the back of the hall. "Darling, this is a legacy summit, not a fucking sample sale." The insult landed with the force of a physical blow. Smirks blossomed behind raised glasses. A press photographer in the corner, initially snapping photos of Tiffany, lowered his camera, his face a mask of confusion and conflict. Should he document this brutal takedown, or pretend he hadn't seen it? At the center of it all, the woman in blue, our protagonist, our queen in waiting, lifted her wine glass. Slowly, deliberately. Not a single tremor in her hand betrayed the storm that must have been raging within. Her face was a placid lake, betraying nothing of the depths below. She took a single measured sip of the vintage Bordeaux, her movements economical and precise. Then she placed the stem back on the table with a soft click, a sound that was somehow louder than all the whispers in the room. She was a master of patience, and patience in a room full of sharks is a superpower. She didn't take the bait, she never did. Tiffany tilted her head, a predator unsatisfied with its prey's lack of struggle. She was used to reactions, tears, stuttering defenses, people crumbling under the white-hot spotlight of her disdain. This woman's silence was unnerving. It was an act of defiance she couldn't comprehend. So she pushed harder, her voice laced with venom. "This table is for the architects of the future, the pioneers. Security can show you to the lobby if you're looking for more suitable company." A new sound rippled through the ballroom, a collective, suppressed gasp. The quiet was gone. The air was now charged, electric with tension. Near the service station, a young waitress, no older than 20, nearly dropped a tray of empty glasses, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. A few feet away, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, a venture capitalist known for his ruthless instincts, discreetly pulled out his phone. The small red light on its lens glowed like a malevolent eye as he began to record. But at the heart of the hurricane, the woman in cobalt blue remained unmoved. Her expression was calm, almost serene, because this was just another Tuesday. At 26, she'd been mistaken for the coat check girl at a conference, where she was the keynote speaker. At 34, a board member had asked her to fetch him coffee during a pitch meeting for her own 9-figure company. And now, at 48, after building a global tech empire from nothing but code and sheer fucking will, an empire that could buy and sell this entire mountain resort 10 times over, she was still being told she didn't belong. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the terrifying, oppressive calm before a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. It was the pause before the thunder. Tiffany, emboldened by the lack of a fight, leaned closer. The diamonds around her neck glittered like shards of ice in the candlelight. She was determined to humiliate this woman, to write the narrative in front of this audience of influencers, investors, and innovators. She wanted to own the moment. But what the little girl in the red dress, playing queen in a castle of daddy's money, didn't understand was devastatingly simple. The woman in cobalt blue already owned the goddamn room. Tiffany wasn't one to let a moment breathe. She thrived on escalation. Attention was her oxygen. With a theatrical flick of her wrist, she flagged down the resort's general manager, a man named Peterson whose spine seemed to dissolve as he approached. Her voice was pitched to a near shriek, ensuring it sliced through every remaining pocket of conversation. "Peterson, she's not supposed to be here. This table is reserved. Get her out." Peterson froze, caught in an impossible position. He executed a half-bow, half-stutter, his eyes darting nervously. He knew the woman in cobalt blue. Not by name, not by reputation, but by the quiet, gravitational pull of her presence. He'd seen her arrive earlier, completely alone. No fawning assistants, no muscle-bound security, no swarm of photographers. Just her. He'd assumed she was the +1 of some tech mogul, a quiet wife, or a discreet investor. Now, Tiffany Vandermeer, the daughter of the man whose money was the lifeblood of this resort, was forcing his hand. His professional survival instinct was at war with the screaming alarm bells in his gut. Across the room, the young waitress, the one who'd nearly dropped her tray, was now completely still. The wine glasses on her platter rattled, not from the vibrations of the room, but from the trembling of her own hands. Her eyes, wide and furious, flickered from the arrogant heiress in red to the silent queen in blue. She knew, with the certainty of someone who is invisible and therefore sees everything, that something was profoundly, disgustingly wrong. Tiffany pressed her advantage, leaning across the polished mahogany table. Her lips curled into a practiced sneer, like a B-list actress delivering what she thought was her Oscar-winning line. "Security will handle this. Tonight's gala is for the real elite, not imposters in last-season gowns." A wave of laughter, nervous but complicit, rolled through a few of the nearby tables. A well-known power couple seated near the stage exchanged an uncomfortable glance but remained silent. The cameras kept flashing. In a room full of self-proclaimed leaders and innovators, not one had the courage to be the first to object. And that's when the woman in blue finally lifted her eyes. Slowly. It was like a curtain rising on a stage everyone thought belonged to someone else. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just looked at Tiffany. And that gaze, that single, unwavering look, seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. It was a look that communicated history, power, and a profound, chilling disappointment. Then came the point of no return. Tiffany, high on her own cruelty, reached for a glass of deep red Cabernet. She raised it not to drink, but to destroy. With a flick of her wrist, she tipped the glass downward. The wine arced through the air, a dark crimson serpent, and spilled across the pristine white tablecloth. It rushed toward the CEO's sleeve, blooming into a dark, violent stain on the perfect cobalt blue silk. The gasp was universal. It was sharp, collective, the kind of sound that feels like a physical impact, the kind of sound that makes chandeliers tremble. "There," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness as she placed the empty glass down with a delicate clink. "Now the dress matches the aesthetic." The young waitress, standing frozen 20 feet away, muttered it under her breath, the words barely audible but formed with utter conviction. "This is wrong." Phones, once held discreetly, were now lifted higher. The pretense was gone. Every guest had turned in their seat. The invisible line between spectator and witness had just been crossed in blood-red wine. The CEO in blue didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Tiffany. She simply set her own untouched wine glass aside, unfolded a clean linen napkin, and began to gently press it against the spreading stain on her sleeve. Her movements were calm, methodical, as if she were tending to a minor inconvenience. Then, with that same terrifying calm, she picked up her phone from the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet, yet it cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. "Initiate Protocol Crimson." The words were spoken softly into the device. "Tonight's event is now a logged incident." On the other end of the line, a voice responded instantly, crisp and efficient, just audible enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Confirmed. Blackbriar portfolio is active and ready for immediate liquidation. $7 billion. All media channels are on standby, awaiting your command." She didn't smile. A smile would have been a concession, an admission of victory. She didn't need to. She simply returned the phone to the table, her hand resting flat on the cool linen. Her silence was now heavier than any shout could ever be. Tiffany blinked, her performance momentarily derailed by the lack of a hysterical reaction. Then she laughed again, a sound that was now shrill, sharp, and laced with a new thread of uncertainty. "Oh, darling," she mocked, "making fake phone calls doesn't buy you class. Security will still be taking you out." But she was wrong. The tide in the room had already turned. Guests were whispering furiously, servers were hesitating, their professional masks slipping, and the red glow of recording lights had multiplied, a constellation of silent witnesses blinking in the opulent darkness. What Tiffany Vandermeer, in her cocoon of privilege, had failed to realize was that every insult, every drop of wine, every hateful word had not been an attack. It had been evidence. The storm hadn't even started yet. The ballroom was no longer a celebration. It was a stage, and the final act was about to begin. The whispers in the ballroom were no longer whispers. They were a rising tide of judgment. Forks lay abandoned on plates of untouched filet mignon. The string quartet, hired to provide a soft, elegant ambiance, had faltered, their bows hovering silently over their instruments. Everyone was watching. The heiress, Tiffany, sensing her iron grip on the room slipping, snapped her fingers at the petrified banquet manager, Peterson. "Why are you still standing there? Remove her! This is my family's gala, and I will not have it contaminated by strays." The word strays hung in the air, cruel and ugly. It echoed off the crystal and marble, landing like a punch in the gut of every person in the room who had ever felt like an outsider. It was a mistake, a fatal one. You could feel a dozen spines stiffen in silent protest. Peterson stepped forward, his feet dragging as if chained. His eyes desperately avoided the woman in the cobalt dress, focusing instead on Tiffany's furious face. He opened his mouth, the words catching in his throat. "Ma'am," he began, "perhaps we should just verify her invitation?" Tiffany cut him off with a laugh as sharp as broken glass. "Invitation? Please! People like her don't get invitations. They sneak in, hoping some of the glitter will rub off." From the back of the room, near the now silent string quartet, the young waitress finally found her voice. It was louder this time, trembling but clear. "I saw her name on the guest list." Her tray rattled on its stand as every single head in her vicinity swiveled in her direction. "Jones," she added, her voice gaining strength. "Executive tier." Tiffany spun around, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits. "And who the hell are you? A server. Know your place before I have you fired." But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone at a neighboring table whispered, "She's on the list." Another leaned in close to their companion. "Then why is Tiffany treating her like this?" The phones tilted higher. The recording lights multiplied, a swarm of angry red fireflies. The CEO, Serafina Jones, still hadn't risen from her chair. Her hands rested calmly on the tablecloth, one near her phone, the other gently smoothing the wine-stained fabric of her dress. Her gaze lifted just enough to meet the eyes of the young waitress across the vast room. It was a silent exchange, but it carried more weight, more meaning, than Tiffany's entire tirade. In that single look, there was gratitude, acknowledgement, and a silent promise. Then, the first crack in the wall of silence appeared. A guest near the stage, an older man with a mane of silver hair, a brutally sharp suit, and a reputation as a venture capitalist who didn't suffer fools, stood up. His name was Marcus Thorne, and when he spoke, the room listened. His voice was a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. "I don't know what kind of pathetic power game you think you're playing, young lady," he said, looking directly at Tiffany. "But I've been attending these events for 30 years. I know humiliation when I see it, and tonight it's not hers, it's yours." The room stirred. A wave of audible agreement rolled across the tables. Someone started clapping. It was a single, tentative sound, but it was quickly followed by another, and then another. Tiffany's face flushed a shade of red that clashed violently with her dress. Her perfect smile was cracking at the edges. "This is my resort," she insisted, desperation now leaking through the carefully constructed facade of glamour. "My family built this legacy. I decide who belongs here." And finally, the woman in cobalt blue moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if she were moving through water, she rose to her feet. The crimson stain on her dress caught the light, looking less like a mark of shame and more like a wound sustained in battle. But her spine, that rod of steel, remained unbroken. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and it sliced through the tension like a diamond cutting glass. "You just made a very critical mistake," she said, each syllable landing with deliberate, percussive force. "You mistook my silence for permission." The ballroom froze. Every guest, every server, every photographer leaned in. The recording lights of 100 phones were now focused on her. Hearts pounded in the sudden, absolute silence. Tiffany blinked, faltering for the first time. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" But the CEO didn't answer her. Not yet. She simply turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the entire room, from the gawking guests to the terrified staff to the now recording cameras. She was allowing the weight of her words to settle, to take root in the minds of every witness. She was letting them understand that the tide had not just shifted. The dam had broken. The witnesses were no longer silent. The room was no longer Tiffany's. It already belonged to the woman in blue. Tiffany's smile, now a brittle, transparent thing, hardened into a mask of defiance. The sycophantic laughter that had once buoyed her had evaporated, but she refused to surrender the spotlight. It was the only thing she had. Her heels clicked an angry staccato on the marble floor as she closed the distance, standing directly in front of Seraphina Jones. "You think a few clever words change anything?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper sharp enough to pierce the thick silence. "This is my family's house, my family's ballroom, and you?" She gestured contemptuously at the dark, spreading stain on the cobalt silk. "Are just a piece of trash that overstayed its welcome." Seraphina didn't so much as flinch. She stood anchored to the floor, her shoulders squared, her eyes as steady as a starless night sky. The quiet around her thickened. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was the active, suffocating presence of judgment. Every single person in that room was now listening, not to the shrill heiress, but to the silent CEO. The general manager, Peterson, shifted on his feet, sweat beading on his upper lip. His career-long loyalty was being stress-tested under the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes and dozens of glowing red recording lights. "Miss Vandermeer," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Maybe we should de-escalate. The guests—" "Remove her," Tiffany snapped, cutting him off with the force of a whip crack. "That's a direct order, now." The young waitress, Maria, stepped forward, her now abandoned tray forgotten on a nearby table. Her voice shook, but her words were crystal clear. "She has a right to be here. I checked the reservation system myself this afternoon." A new ripple shot through the guests. Gasps, shocked mutters, disbelief. The narrative was slipping from Tiffany's grasp, and she knew it. Her cheeks flushed an even deeper, angrier red. "You'll regret speaking out of turn," she spat at Maria. "Staff are not to contradict the guests, especially not me." But it was too late. The line between staff and witness, between silence and complicity, had been crossed. Maria stood a little taller, emboldened by the weight of the moment, by the silent support in Seraphina's eyes. "Then fire me," she said, her voice trembling but unyielding. "But I won't stand here and lie for you." Seraphina's eyes flickered toward the young woman. A brief, almost imperceptible nod. An acknowledgement. Quiet gratitude, sharp as tempered steel. From the far end of the room, another witness rose. Marcus Thorne, the silver-haired venture capitalist, raised his glass as if making a toast. "Enough," he declared, his voice booming across the tables. "We have all seen what happened. We all know who is in the wrong here." A murmur of agreement swept through the ballroom like a fast-moving current. Guests who had been silent just minutes before were now finding their voices, speaking aloud what they had previously only whispered. She was targeted. That wine stain was no accident. This is a public humiliation, plain and simple. Tiffany's tenuous grip on control was unraveling. Her hands, adorned with diamond rings, twitched at her sides, her manicured nails digging into her palms. "You're all being manipulated," she barked, her voice growing ragged. "She doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong in our world." Those words, our world, hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Seraphina finally broke her stillness. She took a single, deliberate step forward, just enough for the crimson-stained silk of her dress to catch the light from the chandeliers above. Her voice was low, but it resonated in every corner of the room. "You think your wealth gives you ownership of this room," she said, her tone devoid of emotion, making the words even more chilling. But wealth without wisdom is just noise. And tonight, your noise is ending. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or celebratory. It was deliberate, slow, steady, like a judge's gavel striking a block of wood. One clap, then another, then dozens, a rhythmic, damning verdict delivered by the very people Tiffany had sought to impress. And for the first time all night, Tiffany Vandermeer, heiress to billions, looked small. Pathetic. The ballroom was shifting. What had begun as whispers had turned into ripples, and those ripples were now forming a tidal wave. Phones were no longer hidden. They were held high, openly recording, live streaming the downfall in real time. Guests who moments ago were sipping champagne now leaned forward, their eyes locked on the confrontation. No one was eating. No one was dancing. The gala had become a tribunal. Tiffany's breath hitched, coming in shallow little gasps beneath the brilliant glow of the chandeliers. She tried to rally, to gather the tattered remnants of her bravado, but every time she opened her mouth, the room seemed less and less willing to listen. This is ridiculous, she said, forcing a laugh that cracked and splintered midway through. She's a nobody. Just look at her. No entourage, no pedigree, no class. Serafina turned her head slightly, as if the insult were nothing more than a mild breeze, unworthy of acknowledgement. She picked up her phone, tapped the screen once, and lifted it to her ear. Her voice was as calm and deliberate as a ticking clock. Rachel, log this moment. Activate the escalation protocol. Full portfolio review. On the other end, her assistant's reply came through, sharp, steady, and ready for war. Understood. 7 billion is positioned, awaiting your word. She lowered the phone, placing it gently back onto the linen. No flourish, no theatrics. Just the quiet, crushing weight of absolute certainty. The young waitress, Maria, edged closer to the center of the drama, her voice carrying more strength this time. She's telling the truth. I saw the system this morning. Jones, executive clearance, top tier. The guests murmured louder now, the information spreading like wildfire. Marcus Thorne stood again, his voice carrying like a judge delivering a final verdict. If she is who I think she is, then every word you've spoken tonight, every action you've taken, will follow you far beyond this ballroom. Tiffany spun toward him, her face a pale, powdered mask of rage. You don't understand. This is my hotel, my family's empire. No one tells me who belongs here. But even as she shrieked the words, she saw them. The glow of dozens and dozens of tiny red lights, all blinking back at her. Cameras, live streams, evidence being created, archived, and disseminated in real time. And then, for the first time that night, the CEO, Serafina Jones, smiled. It wasn't a wide, flashy smile. It was a precise, minimalist curve of the lips, a smile so sharp it could have cut through Tiffany's unraveling confidence. She spoke quietly, yet every single word landed with the force of a hammer blow across the entire hall. You've mistaken this ballroom for your inheritance, she said, but it isn't yours to keep. Not anymore. Tiffany scoffed, a last, desperate gasp of defiance. And who's going to take it from me? You? Serafina didn't answer. Not yet. Her silence was heavier than thunder, and every guest leaned closer, their bodies coiled in anticipation. Knowing something monumental was about to happen. From the corner of the room, the young waitress whispered to a colleague, her words just loud enough for a nearby phone's microphone to catch. I don't think she's going to take it from her. I think she already owns it. The whisper spread like a contagion. First as a murmur, then as a rumor, then as a staggering, earth-shattering belief. And belief, once it takes root, grows faster and stronger than any lie. Peterson's forehead glistened with a thick sheen of sweat under the hot lights. He had been the general manager of this resort for 20 years. He had memorized the surnames of every major donor, navigated the egos of celebrities, and survived more than one hushed-up scandal. But tonight, he looked like a man who had been cornered by a predator he didn't even know existed. "Miss," he said to Tiffany, his voice low, pleading. "Perhaps we should resolve this quietly. The guests are watching." Tiffany snapped her head toward him, her eyes flashing with fury. "Then let them watch. She doesn't belong here." Her arm slashed through the air, a gesture of command befitting a queen in a crumbling imaginary court. "Escort her out, now." The manager hesitated, and in that single, fatal pause, the truth of the situation unfolded. He was afraid, not of the screaming heiress in red, but of the silent woman in blue, who still hadn't raised her voice. Tiffany, sensing his hesitation, raised her own tone to a fever pitch. "Do your job, or are you as useless as the rest of them?" A hush fell over the room, heavier than any before. The insult wasn't aimed at the CEO anymore. It was aimed at her own staff. And staff, unlike wealthy guests, have long memories. From the edge of the banquet floor, a senior concierge, a woman named Elena Ruiz, known for her quiet competence and encyclopedic knowledge of the hotel's operations, stepped forward. She rarely spoke in public settings. Tonight, her voice was clear and steady. "I saw Ms. Jones's name in our system this morning. It was flagged. Executive tier. Owner-level clearance." The words detonated in the center of the hall. Guests gasped. Phones zoomed in closer. Tiffany whirled around, fury twisting her perfectly made-up features. "You're lying!" But Elena didn't so much as blink. She repeated the words, louder this time. "Owner, level, clearance." Peterson's eyes widened. His lips parted, but no sound, no defense, came out. Tiffany's mask of composure finally cracked into 100 pieces. "Do you even know who I am?" she shouted, her voice breaking with hysteria. "This is my family's empire. My name is on the doors. My name is the legacy." She grabbed another glass of wine, her hand trembling so violently that some of it sloshed over the rim. With a desperate cry, she hurled it toward the cobalt blue dress. This time, Serafina didn't move an inch. She stood there as the red liquid splashed across the tablecloth, pooling like fresh blood against the white linen. Gasps turned to shouts. Someone cried out, "That's assault!" Another voice chimed in, "She's completely lost it." The CEO reached for a napkin, calmly dabbed at the new stain, then lifted her phone one last time. Her tone was quieter than a whisper, yet it carried farther than any scream. "Rachel, escalate. Alert the board. Initiate the full withdrawal." Tiffany's eyes widened in confusion. "Board? What board? This is my event." But in that instant, the balance of power had irrevocably broken. The witnesses in the room no longer saw a glamorous hostess defending tradition. They saw a violent, unhinged tyrant unraveling in a red dress soaked not in elegance, but in pure, unadulterated rage. And across the hall, the applause began again. Slow, deliberate, building like the drums of war, the room had chosen its side. The ballroom had transformed. The murmurs had become an uproar. What began as whispers now thundered like waves breaking against a cliff face. Guests were standing, phones held aloft like torches, some of them narrating the events into live streams that were now rocketing across the globe. Tiffany, breathing in ragged, shallow gulps, her red dress shimmering under the harsh glare of the chandeliers, wasn't finished. She staggered closer, her eyes locked on the cobalt silk, now grotesquely blotched with wine. Her voice dropped low, a venomous, guttural sound meant to inflict a final, fatal wound. You're nothing, she hissed. A stain pretending to be a star, and when you're gone from here, no one will even remember your name. The words were so vile, so nakedly cruel, that they silenced even the chaos. For a single heart-stopping moment, the ballroom froze. Then, a new wave of gasps cut through the air. Someone muttered, "She did not just say that." Another whispered, "This will destroy her. This will destroy her entire family." The manager, Peterson, finally lurched forward, perhaps to intervene, but Tiffany shoved him aside. Desperate to finish the scene she delusionally thought she still controlled, she snatched the linen napkin from Serafina's place setting. She lifted it high, and with an act of deliberate, calculated cruelty, began to wipe furiously at the cobalt dress, as if trying to scrub a piece of filth from a priceless fabric. "There," she spat. "Cleaner now, almost like you belong. Almost." The crowd erupted. A woman near the back of the room shouted, "Stop it!" Others gasped aloud, their hands flying to their mouths. Phones shook as the hands holding them trembled with disbelief and rage. The young waitress, Maria, stepped into the open space, her voice sharp and quivering with righteous fury. "That's enough," she cried out. "She's on the list. She belongs here more than you do." Tiffany rounded on her, her face a twisted mask of hate. "Stay silent, or you're finished. You hear me? Finished!" But silence was dead and buried. Marcus Thorne, the venture capitalist, raised his glass again, his voice ringing like a gavel of judgment. "We've witnessed every insult, every act of aggression. You've crossed a line tonight in front of the entire world." Tiffany, cornered but still defiant, turned back to the woman in blue, her eyes wild with panic. "Security!" she screamed. "Drag her out if you have to!" Two large security guards at the edge of the room shifted uneasily. They were built like refrigerators, but their faces were pale with uncertainty. They looked from the shrieking heiress to the silent CEO, and then to the dozens and dozens of phones capturing every single second. Moving on her now wouldn't just be career suicide, it would be a global incident. And that's when Serafina Jones finally moved. She rose to her full height, the crimson stains blooming across her waist and sleeve like war paint. Her gaze was unshaken. Her voice was calm, but it cut like a razor. "You think humiliation builds a legacy? It doesn't. It ends one." The applause began again, not scattered this time, but rolling, fierce, undeniable. Guests were clapping louder, some were even on their feet, their eyes no longer on Tiffany, but on the woman she had tried so desperately to erase. Tiffany faltered, the last of her bravado crumbling to dust. For the first time, her voice was small, a pathetic crack. Who even are you?" Serafina's eyes narrowed, a glint of the coming storm in their calm depths. She did not answer yet. Not until the silence begged for it. Not until the room was so taut with anticipation it felt like it might snap. Because when she spoke next, the entire legacy of the girl in the red dress and the family name she wielded like a weapon would collapse into ruin. The chandeliers above flickered, as if the very air in the room had become unstable, bracing for the impact. The woman in cobalt blue, calm, steady, and unbroken, picked up her phone again. There was no rush, no tremor, just a single deliberate movement that held the entire room in its thrall. She lifted it to her ear, her eyes never leaving Tiffany, who now stood trembling in her crimson dress. "Rachel," she said, her voice even and low, but amplified by the utter silence of 100 guests leaning in, desperate to hear. "Confirm the escalation, notify the board, full withdrawal protocol, immediate execution." The ballroom seemed to inhale as one. From the other end of the line, the reply was crisp, clean, and merciless. "Confirmed. All systems are live. $7 billion in assets have been marked for liquidation. Executing on your word, Miss Jones." The CEO lowered the phone, her hand returning to rest on the table as if she had just ordered a cup of coffee. But the effect rippled through the room with the force of a shock wave. Guests gasped, murmurs erupted, phones tilted even closer. Tiffany tried to laugh, a brittle, ugly sound that cracked under the immense pressure. "Oh, please," she sneered, her voice thin and reedy. "7 billion? Do you really expect anyone here to believe that? You're bluffing. All of you are being fooled by a con artist in a stained dress." But her words no longer carried authority. They only carried fear. The young waitress, Maria, spoke again, her voice firm now, her courage swelling with the weight of hundreds of witnesses behind her. "She's not bluffing. Her name is Jones. I saw it myself in the system. Executive tier. Owner-level clearance." The name hit the room like a clap of thunder. Jones. Guests turned to each other, their faces masks of dawning, horrified realization. A woman at a front table whispered, "Wait, as in Serafina Jones, of the Blackbriar Group?" Her husband answered, his face ashen. "Yes, that Jones." Tiffany's face drained of all color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The blood had left her face, leaving behind a ghastly white canvas for her smeared makeup. Marcus Thorne nodded once, his expression solemn, almost reverent. "I suspected," he said, his voice low. "But to have it confirmed. My God." Serafina Jones finally looked up, meeting Tiffany's panicked, uncomprehending eyes with a calm so sharp it could have cut marble. "You wanted me gone," she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "But you forgot one very important detail." She paused. "I don't attend events I don't already own." A collective gasp, louder than any before, tore through the hall. Some people clapped immediately, spontaneously. Others simply stared, their minds struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the moment as the weight of her words settled over the hall like a judge's final verdict. Tiffany stumbled back a step, her arrogance and composure collapsing in on themselves like a dying star. "No!" she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "No, that's impossible. This is—" Serafina tilted her chin, a minuscule movement that transformed her calm into something terrifyingly powerful. "Impossible? You're standing on my floor, drinking from my crystal, and hosting a banquet funded by my trust." The silence that followed was suffocating. Absolute. Then, from the far end of the hall, the applause erupted. It was loud, unrestrained, and defiant. It spread like a wildfire, rolling across the tables, building into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the resort. Tiffany Vandermeer stood frozen in her blood-red dress, the sparkle gone from her diamonds, her inherited power unraveling thread by thread in front of the entire world. And at the center of it all, the woman in cobalt blue, Serafina Jones, finally allowed herself the faintest, most devastating of smiles. The storm had arrived.